Hi, my name is Debbie Simon and I'm here today at the Beaducation Studios, and I am here to share with you some resin techniques in my class, Mold It, Cast It. This is an intermediate class, so if you haven't had a lot of experience with resin, I would suggest that you would take a look at my free Bezel class, because it does talk a lot about the basics, but also for those of you that have used resin, it might be a great refresher and you might be able to pick up some tips and techniques to carry into this class. The great thing about this class and this online version is I don't need to tailor the class. I can present all the information, and anybody in any level of working with resin can gain something from it. So I really don't want anybody to come into this feeling intimidated at all by the fact that it's an intermediate level class. I think you'll be able to find a lot to work with and a great starting point no matter what level you're at. Before we get started, I want to talk to you a little bit about the tools and materials that I use. And as we go through this section, you're going to find that there's a lot of different things that I use and play with, but I also want you to know the sky's the limit. I mean, these are just some suggestions. What I love about my classes and teaching in person is people bring such great materials to work with, and that's part of the fun of casting with resin and making molds with resin. Try it. Try any type of material that you find out there. It's an inexpensive piece of resin casted. Hey, have fun with it, and let's see what other products you can bring to it as well. One of the things that you will need is a two-part silicone putty. There's a lot of variety out there as far as different products, and it doesn't matter which one you have. You can use any of them. You know, they will have a little different properties, but all you really need is a silicone putty. Some of the other things that you will need for today's class is a two-part epoxy. We also have the two-part resin, some baby wipes, paper towels, toothpicks, measuring cups, and some stir sticks. Some of the additional tools I like to use is a foam brush that you can get at your local craft store, a Sharpie or a permanent marker, and then just a simple set of tweezers. The following are some of the products and things I use for my finishing techniques to finish a casting piece. Here is wet dry sandpaper. We have some emery boards in different grits or grades. I work with some files of different shapes and sizes. I use the silly putty. I also use a Dremel or a hand drill from home to drill in holes. And then these are just some finishing things that I like to use to make my pieces into pendants or different types of pieces of jewelry. These are just backings that can glue on, and here are some eye pins. Here's a selection of inclusions, or the type of inclusions I like to use in my casting pieces. We have a variety of glitters and gold leaves or leafing. We have some sequins, and then these are just a bunch of found objects I've collected along the way, my little treasures that I like to use. These are some of the things I like to use when I'm adding color to my castings. I use a lot of oil paint, and I always have oil paint in my studio. For a powder pigment, I love using the Pearl X powders because they have a nice effect. I also like to use some rubber stamping dyes and inks to stamp the actual mold itself. And just remember, these are just a few ideas for colors. There's so many more out there, and we're not limited to these, but these are just the things I like to use. One of the fun things about resin, and one of my favorite things, is actually working with molds. As you can see here, we have a variety of types of molds that I like to work with, and I did want to talk a little bit about what are good molds, what aren't so good molds, and just a little bit of the great resources I've found along the ways to use for molding with resin. The big ones here are all actual ice cube trays, and the great thing about the ice cube trays, they're actually a really fun size and shape, and they create a lot of great pieces. This one here in particular, I find you can find these at the dollar store, and what's great about these is they're only $1. They have really fun different shapes, and I probably have about 10-15 of these that I've collected along the way. So whenever I do come across one of these molds, I always grab it because for $1, why not? And a lot of fun things have come out of them. These ones in particular these are also silicone ice cube molds. They're a little more fancier and a little more expensive, but they have some really great, unique molds out there. But I want to talk a little bit more about what makes a good mold and why I gravitate to certain molds. You want it to be silicone because the silicone molds will, the resin will pop out of the casted resin will pop out of the mold rather easily. But you also want it to be flexible. If you can see in this ice cube tray, see how flexible this is? And what's great is no matter what the piece is, I can just push it out and it'll come right out. In fact, here I have a piece and I'll just show you real quickly. I can actually take it out this easy. You got to work with it a little bit. But, the great thing is that's how easy it comes out, and I can put my mold back together. The metal clay ones as well are the same thing. They have, they're very flexible, and your pieces just pop out, and it's that easy. And the nice thing too is a lot of people ask about release, and I don't have to spray release in any of the silicone molds, which I prefer not to use a release anyhow because it can show up on the resin. So it's important to find a mold that has these properties. Now that we've talked about some of the molds that actually work well, I want to talk about some of the products out there or molds that you can find along the way that don't work so well. There's a lot of candy molds that come in this kind of hard plastic, and they're made for making either candies or hard sugar candies. They are too hard a lot of times to actually get your resin out of the piece. I have found ways to work around it and to talk about that a little bit. If you get a hard plastic mold like this and you just love the design and you want to use it, I would fill it with resin. And at this point, you're going to have to basically cut it out of the mold, and you're going to ruin the mold. So whatever mold you buy, make sure if you are going to cast it with resin, and try to do it a different way that you're willing to lose the mold and the expense put into the mold. So again, if it isn't real expensive and I love it, I would just mold it with the resin. And as you can see here, like this one I can get out, but if this was totally filled, I wouldn't have been able to get it out that easy. I wouldn't have been able to move this enough. So I would cut around here and just kind of start cutting off the plastic, and then I would have a finished piece. Some of the other things, this one is a very hard plastic, so it is hard to get things out. The fact that it has a little bit of flexibility, I might be successful, I might not. So again, it's up to you if you're willing to risk the expense of buying the mold and then finding it doesn't work. Another great option is found objects. I do a lot of containers where you find this nice hard plastic, and some of them are thicker too, but the great thing about it is they have some great shapes that I can work off of. So I will cast in this and mold it, and again, I'm in the same situation where I'll probably have to crack this and cut into it to get the piece out so that I can work with it, and then I would actually re-mold it in a different material. Now, we've already talked about some pre-made molds or molds that you can buy already available that are mold you can make finished products from. But once you get past that, one of the great things when I'm teaching that students really find exciting is realizing they can pretty much mold anything. There's some great products out there that we've already discussed that are available, and it's so easy to mold something. And here's a good example of this piece. This is the piece I started with, and it was actually something I created out of Sculpey clay, but I molded it with this mold material here. This was a 2-part silicone mold material, and this was the mold, and then I cast it. This was one of the pieces that was casted and pulled out of the mold when it was done. So there's kind of a piece in works. And then this piece here is actually a piece that I've been working on and adding to it. So it's great to see the flexibility you have by being able to create your own molds and put things together. So again, the black part here is another mold that I've done. This is the mold that is shown here, but I can rivet things together. I can do a lot of fun things with it to make a finished piece. So it is really great to have available an option to make your own molds, because there's so many great things out there to mold. So what can you mold? There are a variety of great things out there that you can mold, and if you know me and my personality, I would say you can mold anything. So if there's a will, there's a way. And my friends will all say that I'm constantly like, oh wow, we can mold that. So keep that in mind when you're out looking for treasures, because most of them, if you like it, can be molded. Here's a few examples of some things I've collected along the way. Right here we have a couple nature objects, and those are great. everyone is so different, so you never know what you can come across, and it's great. And there's a lot of different ways we can mold these for different types of purposes that we want to do. Another great resource I find is all these vintage pieces. They are some wonderful metal stampings with a lot of great detail. They end up translating into finished castings really well. Some of these too, again, small keys are always popular and they're fun to do. We also have like coins and things like this. This is an old ethnic piece. Then we have here are some pieces that I've actually designed out of Sculpey clay. So I do like to do a lot of my own designs, which is very easy to do, you know, once you know the basics of working with polymer clays. So again, I just make these and then I mold them. And then these are some fun objects that I found along the way too. You know, different things from my kids and what's in their collection. Also different game pieces are a really great thing to mold as well. And you're going to see when you look at all these pieces, there are two ways to mold. One is if it's a one-sided mold, or the second way if it's a two-sided mold. If you look at a piece like this, you know, it's clear that it has two very distinct sides. And I will end up showing you how to mold that in two parts and put it together to make a three-dimensional piece like this. Or if I want it, I could also just mold it one side of this and made it flat on the back. Kind of like these ones will be. These ones will end up being just a flat piece on the back side. Same thing with a lot of these. You can notice that there's a couple different dimensions that you could do. And again, these ones are just actual flat-sided. So in the end, they'll have a solid back. So these are just some of the great things I've found along the way that I like to work with, and I'm sure if you look through your collection, you're going to find a lot of great things to mold as well. Now that I've shown you a lot of different things that we can mold, and there's a lot of fun things out there that are at your disposal, I want to talk about what's not okay to mold. And this is really important to me as an artist and working with a great group of artists. You know, they work very hard to design and come up with their pieces, and with all these materials that are available to easily mold things and cast them, you just need to make sure and be very clear that you're not molding somebody's artwork. And here's a few examples. This one is a Zoa Art glass bead. These ones are from Green Girl Studios. Now they've put a lot of work and time and marketing into the branding of their art and their pieces, and it would not be okay to mold these pieces. It just would be very unfair to the artist, and it's just not right. And especially because there's so many great things out there already that are copyright free, like vintage things. That's why I love to use the vintage pieces, because we know there's no copyright on those. You're not taking anybody's design that still has ownership to it. And nature I love because it's always unpredictable, and they're all different, and they are original. Now that we've talked about all the great things that you can mold, I want to pull out these two specifically, because these are the two that we are going to mold today as an example. And the reason I picked this one, again, this is a vintage piece. It's a nice piece because I'm going to mold this on one side. So it is a one-side mold. Again, we're going to end up having the back will end up being flat on this when we do a finished cast piece. This one is a great, it's a piece of nature, which I love to work with, but also it's a great example of the two sides are very different. And I do want to work with showing you how to actually make a very three-dimensional piece using the two sides. And basically what we're going to do is mold those sides two separately, cast the piece, and you're going to end up putting the piece together. And it's a great easy way to do a two-part mold. There's other ways you can do that are more complex that get into a lot of other things, but this is the easiest for our purposes, especially in the size that we're working with. It's just as easy to cast two sides and glue them together. To learn how to mold with the silicone putty, I am going to start with the one-sided one, the first one that we talked about, because it's a very easy thing to mold, and I just want to talk to you a little bit about how to properly mix and get the right quantities of the putty out, and then actually how to work with a mold in molding. So to start with, what we need to do is we need to take two equal parts. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take out some of one of the putties. Doesn't matter which one, and for some reason I always go to the white. I don't know why. And I'm going to take out enough. And how I know that I have enough mold material to actually mold something, I want to roughly see that it's about the size and shape of the piece I'm going to mold. Because when I take the second part, which is going to be an equal part, I've actually doubled that volume, so it'll make it really easy to it'll be enough for the mold. Now the first thing I'm going to do with the white is I'm going to roll it into, it doesn't have to be a real neat ball because you'll see that it's not, a ball. And then I'm going to switch and I'm going to grab the second part of the putty. And again, I want to make sure that my hands are clean and have been cleaned up, because these two properties start reacting together once they touch each other. So if I still have some residue on my hand and I touch this, it could just change the property a little bit. So you want to just use caution that you're not cross-contaminating. So now I'm going to take the purple. You want to be as precise as possible, but it's not as important as it is when you're mixing resin. You need to keep in mind, when mixing the two compounds together, they start to cure right away. So you need to look at the manufacturer's directions, and they'll tell you how much working time you have. With these two-part silicone molds, putties, we probably have 5 minutes tops, and usually I say, plan to have it done and everything, your piece that you're molding in the material within 2 to 3 minutes. Make sure you have your piece ready to go and ready to be molded as soon as you mix these. Okay, now I'm ready to start mixing the material. So really all I want to do is knead the two balls together. Now I find if I go like this and roll it, it doesn't mix up fast enough. So it is easier to use your fingers and just knead this way, because again, time is of the essence. You really want to be molding this fast. And your goal is to get all this marbling to be gone and have this be one solid color. So again, I am kneading this fairly fast, and I'm going to keep working it. Now you see they've got this pretty close. I still have a little marbling in here, but it's starting to become a pretty solid color. So I know that I'm really close to it being done. So I'm just going to get those couple of last pieces of white mixed in. And then at this point, I want to quickly roll this into a very tight ball. I want it to not have any creases or anything. I want it to be pretty solid. So I've now rolled this into a nice ball. It's nice and compressed. And now I'm ready to actually mold it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to look at my piece here. And again, I'd be working a little faster if I wasn't trying to show you these steps. But again, obviously the piece is too big. So I'm just going to flatten this a little bit, get it close to the size, keep it kind of flat. Make sure you have a smooth top. Now that I've actually flattened this out so that I know the piece is going to fit in, I am actually just going to place that piece on top and slowly push it in. Now I don't want to push it in so far that it's going to go through to the bottom of the table, so it's really important that I'm just pushing it in a little bit. And then at this point, I'm actually going to bring the mold material up to it and up over the sides. If you had something with higher sides, you would you'd probably put it in about halfway and then start moving up the sides. So again, this is the great way to, and it's really this easy. And I just want to make sure this is nice and compressed here so that when I'm done and I put it to the side to set, it's got a nice seal. And again, talking about time is really of the essence. Because we're working in the studio under the light, this is curing even faster than my 2-minute window. So again, at home, you'd have a little bit more time to work with it, but really not much. So, but it will work a little bit easier for you because you're not sitting under hot lights. So it is really important to keep that in mind. Now that we've done and you've learned how to actually mix the two parts of the silicone putty together, I want to talk to you a little bit more about doing something that's a little more dimensional. You'll see that the two sides are very different, and to really make this like a great fun charm, it'd be really great to have both sides and have it be a three-dimensional piece as opposed to just molding one side and having a flat back. So some things that you need to think about when I'm going to plan out and before I mix my mold material, I want to kind of think out how I'm going to actually do this. And the easiest way, especially for people like me, who's, I don't do a lot of mold making, it's a real easy technique to just mold these as two separate halves. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mold the first half. And as I'm doing that, I will show you some tips and techniques. So for right now, I'm going to go ahead and mix up my two-part mold material, and I'm going to show you how to do the first half. Now I've already mixed the two parts together, and what I'm going to do this, the first half, is I'm just going to, like we did with the first one I showed how to mold, I'm going to push it about halfway in. And again, I want to make sure I'm not pushing it too far so that I have a nice size width of the floor on the bottom. And then the other thing, I'm just going to bring it up slightly. I don't need to bring it up all the way over just because we're going to mold that as a second part, but I do want to make sure I have enough to work with when I do cast it. So, and right here I can let this sit. Again, I'm going to, now that I have the sides up there nicely, I'm going to kind of squish it in so I can make sure that some of that detail on the bottom, make sure that it's being picked up. And then at this point I would actually take a Sharpie or some type of a marker and just mark actually where I came up to, because that'll be a good guiding point for me when I do the other half. Because now we have the bottom half molded and we will do the top half. While the pieces that we just molded are curing, I want to take the opportunity to talk to you a little bit more about the mold itself, its curing times. Just like resin, there is a setup time, there's a curing time, and there's a workable time. So I want to talk to you a little bit more about that. As you can see, this is just a square wooden block, and I had actually made a mold of it. And I made the mold of it the one day, and literally within 20 minutes I'm able to take this out and I have a pretty cured to touch mold. And it's one of those, people feel that, okay, it's done, I can quick mold this, no problem. You can. If you want to put resin in it today, that same afternoon, you can. But the one thing that you need to know about the two-part silicone putties is they actually have a curing time where the gases need to escape from the mix and the compound that you just created by mixing the two parts. So I originally took this one, I filled it with some resin, and the next day I took my piece out and it looks really bubbly and like this. And the reason it does that is I did not let this set up and cure long enough to let all those gases escape. So while the piece was curing, the casted piece of resin was curing in it, those gases were trying to escape and they left this really bubbly. Now, the rule of thumb is that you should usually wait till the next day to cast something, but I even find, even the next day, there's going to be shortcomings with some of those bubbles. And sometimes I find until you make your first casting or two of the mold, the bubbles are going to be prevalent. So I usually like to, even though I've let it set for a day, I still will pour resin in this and just make another mold of it. And as you can see, this was the second mold, and as you can see, it's not nearly as bubbly, but there's still a little bit of that texture in here. And some of the texture also might be coming from the fact that this was a piece of wood and not completely smooth. But it is important to note that I like to fill this and pour one casting and take it out as just kind of my waste casting, just enough to get some of that reaction out, so that by the time I make a casting that I'm actually committed to for a piece, I know I have a lot of that out and I don't have to make up for it in the finishing processes. Now I've put this to the side and I've let it cure for about 20 minutes. And again, each product you work with is going to have a different curing time. And again, remember that this is the first cure. This is actually you're still able to touch it, you're able to demold whatever it is that you've molded. But again, it's in its early phases as well. So at this point I can go ahead, you can see that it's hardened now, it's not going to move. So it's a good place for me, or a good time for me, that I can take this actually out of the mold. And a lot of times, depending on what you're molding, they're kind of vacuumed in there a little bit. So once you break the seal, a lot of times, like, see how there's kind of this seal, it's like hard to break it. Once I break it and get some air in there, now it's going to come out much easier for me. So literally I am just going to take this out, and if you look at the original, and as you can see, there's a lot of detail in here as far as where the shell is and where the other, like, more rock part is. So again, that's how much detail you can actually get out by casting different products. Okay, now I've mixed up the other set of putty for the second part of the mold. I usually keep my material, or the thing that I've molded, in the original mold, because again, when I go to this next step, I want to make sure that I am actually molding the correct side. So I'm going to quick take it out, just turn it over, and I'm going to push it in. Again, I want to push it in about, a third to halfway, and then I'm going to bring my sides up to it. And again, on the other, I have it marked, and where that line is, I want to make sure that I build this mold just a little bit above it, because it's easier for me to sand some excess off as opposed to not having enough of both shapes to put the two final shapes together. So that is important, to go past that line some. And as you do more of these, you'll get more familiar with, those tips and techniques that work for you and how best to do it. And again, I'm just going to push in on this mold, make sure this is pushed down nice and firmly, and that I've pushed in to get some of that texture. Now that we've had a moment to let this cure for about 20 minutes, we're in the position that we can actually now demold it. And really, demolding it is just as simple as, you want to loosen the sides up, because that's going to take that kind of vacuum pressure off. And this one's fairly easy because it's flat. It's not a real deep piece. We just take it out, and it's great to see all the detail that this two-part silicone putty mold material can pick up. I mean, there's really a lot of detail in here. And at this point, it's ready for casting. We've also allowed time for our two-part, or the two-sided mold that we are doing, to cure. So the second half is cured, and again, same thing, I'm just going to try and loosen up that vacuum seal that's kind of left behind, and I am just going to take our object out, and again, here is our finished mold. Again, you can see the detail, and if you put these side by side, you can actually see how the detail is a little bit different on each, and why it's really important to do both sides and glue them together as a finished piece. Before we get started actually casting the resin into our molds, I want to talk a little bit about color. Now, when I first took my first resin class, I was told very minimal about color, and we were told to focus on, oil paints worked well, a little bit of powder, just to, put just a little bit in. But since then, and since as an artist, I really rely on color a lot in my finished pieces, so it's a very important part to me. I have found so many other ways to add color, and I'm always experimenting. And with the different types of colors, I mean, pretty much anything is worth trying. And when I teach classes, I tell people all the time, you know what, I haven't tried it myself, but yeah, let's try it, because you never know what's going to work and what's not. So far, I have found, if you look at some of the materials I like to use, I am also an oil painter, so I always have oil paints in my studio, and they actually mix really well with the resin. You can use spices, any type of paprika, cayenne pepper. Spices work really well. I get a lot from the scrapbook stores, so there's a lot of these like Pearl-Ex powders and embossing powders. You can use eyeshadow, Kool-Aid, things like that. So, there's so many things that you can use. When you're looking at like the liquids with the oil paints, you can also use acrylic paints, which originally I was told that you can't. But again, like anything, you really just need to know how to test the material and not try it on a committed project that you really need to work well beforehand. So when I'm actually trying new colors, or want to try to see if something's compatible with a resin, I take these great ice cube trays that we've already talked about, and it's a great way for me to just, basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with a clear piece, just an accurate pour of the resin, because I want this control also because it lets me know that I did, it wasn't the color, but it was the resin was poured correctly or mixed correctly. So I start with that, and then I slowly start adding color. And my goal is I'm going to let it cure, and then I'm just going to test it. Does it have the same properties? Is it finish? Can it finish much like a regular resin or other colors that I know have worked in the past with resin? And I'll keep adding more and more. And you're going to start seeing that some of this is not as firm as it should be. And the more color I added, the more acrylic. You can see how it really jeopardized the quality of the resin piece, all the way to the point, I mean, if you look at this one, it is just basically rubber is really what it is. And this wouldn't be good. So I know that, yes, if I put just a little bit of the color, and look at how much, I didn't need a lot, and look at the color. I mean, it's just as strong. So I only needed a little bit of the acrylic, and I know it'll work just fine in my finished pieces. So again, like this was just the craft store colors. They're 89 cents a piece, and the sky's the limit for the colors. So whenever I am trying a new product or a new color, this is kind of what I do, just to make sure that I have what my success rate is going to be. And again, it actually does work. It just doesn't work if I put a lot of it in. As you can see from some of my finished pieces I have done, I definitely like to use color. And I've learned a few things over the years as far as how to add color, how to get different effects. And some of these effects I'm going to go over in more detail as we move forward and I show you the actual casting. But I thought it was important that you at least saw some visuals of what the finished product is going to look like before we start mixing. Now this one is just basically, this is casted with just a clear mold or clear resin. So again, nothing fancy to this. This is just the clear resin shining through. In these examples, this is actually a marbling effect. So I've layered different colors and I've kind of mixed them just a little bit together so that they can start kind of creating that marbled effect. And depending on what stage of curing the resin is in will depend on the look that it gets. Like this one is really marbly, where this is a little more softer. And the reason it's softer is the resin was actually it was mixed right away and poured right away, so you can see that it was a little more fluent. And then some of these other pieces, again, this was a marbling technique, much like these, but I also start adding inside the molds. I actually tip them or touch them a little bit with different paints and powders so that some of those indentations actually start picking up a lot of color. And the great thing is the resin actually just clings on to that, and therefore it actually becomes a permanent piece in the resin, so it's not like it's going to wipe off later. And again, the same type of thing here, except I did more of oil paints on the surface. This one, again, I did some type of surface powder on the texture, but again, did this also with the blue. And again, once we start learning to work with color, there's great effects that we can do, whether it's by layering, marbling. So there's a lot of different options that open up to you once you learn how to work with color a little bit more and use it to expand on your designs. Now I've set up my workstation and I've mixed up a batch of resin, so we're ready to start casting. For those of you that have not worked with resin before, make sure that you go back and take a look at the free class I've done on mixing resin and the tips and techniques, bezel. Okay, now we're ready to start adding color, and there's a couple ways that we can do this. I know that I mentioned a little bit earlier about the different types of color. We have any color that's a liquid. That would include oil paints, acrylics, any type of liquid paints, and even dyes. Even though I've had a little trouble with some of the dyes, they're worth testing, so those would be considered a liquid. And then we have powder type of colors, and those can be anything from these Pearl-X powders, which are really great, embossing powders, also a lot of your spices and things like that would fall in this classification. So again, if it's powdery, it's considered dry, and if it has any type of liquid to it, it's considered a liquid. So the first one I'm going to mix is, I'm going to start with the powder. And what I usually do is I like to mix one batch of resin and pour it off into separate cups so I can mix out a few different colors. I find that it's not worth going back and mixing these little amounts. Plus sometimes the little amounts are harder to get more accurate as far as consistency. So it's easier for me just to make one and pour them off. And again, a lot of times I might have like 4 or 5 colors mixed, and it's a great way for me to just kind of work with a palette of colors. So I have, let's just say, 3 different containers for color. And the first one I'm going to do is actually, let's start with the powder one, and I'm going to do it in a little bit more of the fuller tater. You can add, it doesn't matter how much powder you put in. You can start with something, as little as this, and it's great once you start seeing how that color reacts. And like in this case, it's a nice light tinting with an iridescent. And again, I want to make sure I'm scraping the sides, mixing it thoroughly, getting any of these chunks kind of out of the way so that it's more even. You know, and you'll see that. And again, this is going to actually be a little bit more of a translucent type of color. Now, everybody always asks me, well, how much of that can you put in? I can keep putting it in, and I'm going to show you what happens if I put a lot in. And I usually make a mess when I work with color. Now, if you kind of see how that's going, I mean, it's getting thicker. The color's a little more, it's less translucent. It's actually getting a really nice pigment. And you can really see that translucent or the iridescent actually coming out of it. And again, it's still workable. I know that I'm still going to be able to pour it and do things. The more powder I put in, the thicker this is going to be. Kind of like baking cookies, and you keep adding flour, and you know, early on it stays pretty consistent, but the more you put in. I do find if I put way too much powder in, sometimes the finished resin pieces will be soft, like I showed you in my example with testing color. So again, you know, if you're starting to work with a new powder or any type of pigment, make sure that you're testing it first and just seeing how much you can put in before you start compromising the finished product. Okay, next we are actually going to add some oil paint. And again, I consider this a liquid. And with the oil paint and a lot of these type of paints, I really do not need to put much in to actually color this, which is one of the nice things why I like working with oil paints. And I'm just going to show you real quick. I'm going to start mixing that. Now, because this is a liquid, I need to compensate because I'm throwing off the resin hardener ratio. So I am going to put as much, you know, just eyeball it, doesn't have to be perfect, but I'm going to put a little more hardener in, basically to represent probably as much of the oil that I put in. The more color I put in, the more hardener. So you should kind of, you know, make sure that it's how much hardener is about the same amount of color. Now I'm going to start mixing this, and if you can see, it's kind of chunky and there's big chunks here, and those are the things that I need to make sure that I get out. So I'm going to be a little more vigorous. I like pushing it up against the sides because it breaks that up, and it's again just takes some time because, you know, the oil paint has to break up in the resin mix. And again, I'm going to make sure I'm cleaning my toothpick or my mixing stick. And a lot of times I have leftover oil paint on here or whatever paints I'm doing. I like to grab a new stick, and then that way I don't have to worry about trying to get that to mix in. It's just much easier to do it this way. Now you can see I still have this big chunk, so I really need to work out getting that out before this is going to be ready to cast. And some colors you'll find, like acrylics, mix in here really smoothly. You don't have a lot of trouble with these type of chunks being left. But I do like to work with the oil paints because, as you can see, this is a little more translucent of a color. And with oil paints, anybody that's painted a lot, there are, you know, either opaque colors or colors that are considered more transparent. When you work with acrylics, they are typically very opaque, so you're not going to have some of these qualities. But again, the opaque is really great when you're trying to do something different too, so it's a good option as well. Now we've mixed our two colors, and the great thing is, here's the powder color, here is our liquid color. One of the things I love to do, and something that's really fun to do, is you can actually mix your colors. So now that I have two colors, why not mix them together and see the effect that we get? So I'm just going to pour a little bit in and add a little of the other color. And what I'm trying to show you here is it doesn't matter what type of color is in there. You know, if you're able to use it to color, hey, mix them together. You never know what you're going to create. So it is, you know, don't ever feel that you can't mix a powder and a liquid color together, because you can. And then if you look at this, you can just see how I've altered that even a little bit more. Actually, I'm even going to put a little more purple in here so you can see it a little bit more. Now how this is kind of changing the look of this color a little bit. It's not as pinky, it's really pulling out that iridescent purple that was in the Acrylics powder. So again, now we have three different type of colors that we can work with when we want to start casting. Okay, so if you haven't gotten enough color, I'm going to show you even more ways to color or add colors to your finished casting. So 2 ways I like to do this. One of the ways is using rubber stamp pigment, and I do like to use the stronger pigment, the pigments that are a little higher quality, the dye based. I think it's important, especially for the type of pieces I'm doing. I want to make sure that the quality is there, and for a few extra dollars it's worth having the better material. So to do that, literally, I am just going to make a mess on my finger, and I can do any of the colors, and I'm going to use really high contrasting colors here so that you can kind of see just all the different things that you can do. So I am literally just lightly touching the space. Now what is really nice is when I pour the resin in here, the resin is actually going to adhere to this color and pull the color into the casting. So it's not even that it's going to actually be on the surface, it's actually going to be part of the finished casting piece. So, and I can just, you know, really kind of play with it a little bit here and add some of that detail back so that it's a little more pronounced. Now, other ways I like to do that is I use Pearl-Ex powders a lot, and these do the same type of things. I can pick up the texture just as easily. Sometimes I do both. I'll do the liquid and I'll do a little of this powder, and sometimes I might do like just up here or wherever I want. And it's great because I can even use a sponge. I can brush on here. You know, there's a lot of things I can do, a lot of techniques I can kind of use to add this color. But sometimes it gives it a nice effect to have a little bit different of color. So again, I'm just doing this a little more dramatic with contrast just so that you can kind of see some of the differences. And a lot of times when I teach, the great thing is we'll play with some really unique, weird colors, and the next day when we take it out, we're like, wow, that really worked. It was a great color combination. So it's always fun to play. I always encourage that you play. Try any other type of pigments that you think of. Try it. It can't hurt. Okay, we're now ready to add our colored resin into the mold that we've made and that we've added color to, and it is really as simple as pouring it into it and not letting it go over the sides. So to do that, I'm going to just take a quick mix of the color, make sure it's all mixed, and then I'm slowly going to add, and I like to, you know, you don't want to start out here. Start in the center, your lowest point, and let it get in there and just kind of start filling it slowly. You don't necessarily have to do it too fast because it's nice to let the resin slowly migrate up. And then when we get close to, now we're in this situation, I am running out of our colored resin, which actually is a great time, and I'll show you some great things I like to do with color. But I can take another color and slowly just pour it in here, you know, so it's going to create a little different of an effect, but it'll work great in itself. And you see how the color is kind of bleeding towards itself? It'll actually, if I leave it alone, I will have a nice little clear iridescent area in the center and have the purple be on the outside. But I can also, if I wanted to, kind of play a little bit with it. I don't want to move it around too much so that it's mixed because I want to get some of this real light marbling. It'll still migrate a little bit after what I've done while it's curing, but it's kind of fun to just really see the different effects that you get. Okay, we are now finished casting this one piece, and at this point I'm going to take the piece and I want to put it somewhere safe to rest overnight undisturbed. One of the things I like to do, and one thing to keep in mind, I usually like to put it somewhere where it's a little bit warmer, somewhere where maybe there's a light shining down on it with a little bit of a heat, because the heat's going to help rise the bubbles out, and it's also going to help it set completely overnight. Sometimes if it's in like a damp basement, it might not ever set completely because of just the conditions aren't conducive for it. So I do like to, when I move it, to set it aside, find a nice spot that has a little bit of warmth, maybe a little light, and let it be undisturbed. Okay, we've now finished the first mold that we did, the one part, and now I want to focus on the the mold where we did it in 2 separate parts. What I like about this piece is it's a nature piece, so it's kind of organic, and I wanted to have that kind of shelly, even that iridescent feel, and then also the rock feel. So looking at the colors that we've already mixed, I know up front that this is not going to be the right color. So I can easily enough go back and just add a little bit more color. So in this case, I'm going to add a blue, and I'm going to actually add a lot of it because I want it to be pretty dark. And again, my tip, I usually just sit the piece of paint or how much paint on the stick, and then I just add enough hardener that looks to be about that same spot. And I'm going to add a little more hardener because again, this was a liquid and we need to compensate for that resin and hardener ratio. I'm going to quick clean off my stick and grab a new one because it's going to be easier to mix that color. And again, I just want to mix it much like I did in the earlier one. Make sure all those spots are out of it, all those clumps when you're looking at it. And actually the blue seemed to work in here a little bit better. But see how much I've changed that color? And again, if I had just done the blue, the purple probably added a nice depth to it as well. Now I would like to actually put a little more texture or play with the texture a little bit more on the molds that we did. And there's 2 ways. We talked about using the Pearl-Ex powders and the stamp, rubber stamp pads, but I can also use any oil pastel, oils, any other like heavy duty liquids too, as long as they can stick to the sides. So actually I just want to get a little on my finger, and I'm going to go in here and just again play. Now with this color, it's going to be a little heavier than what we did in the last mold because I do want to have that real depth in the color, and I want it to look like a different part of shell or material coming through. And then for the other parts, I want to add black down here because that's more the rock. So I'm kind of getting in here, and again, I can use a paintbrush, Q-tips, whatever. I tend to use my fingers a lot. And then I do want to just put a hint of this blue just to have kind of a little accent. And again, I'm just playing. And again, it's whatever you feel that you want to do, but I do work a lot with colors and I try a lot of different things. So at this point, the mold's done. I would do the same to the other side just so that I have the colors kind of even and the same type of colorings going on. So I want to make sure both molds are done. And keep my fingers clean in between my colors. So I'd like to just show you a little bit of this detail, and you can see how some of the paint's pulling in there. That's okay because the resin itself is going to kind of take that in and kind of take ownership of it. So it'll be fun to see how this spot is even a little different than the spots over here. So again, it's just playing with different things and finding what ways work for the type of product or finished projects you want to do. So now I am just going to pour the resin, cast it much like we did the first mold. And again, I'm going to try and stir it in the center, slowly moving out. Just let it migrate out to the mold. When you get kind of here, you want to make sure that you're not putting too much resin in and that it's going to kind of pour over to the sides. Because once it does that, sometimes it's hard to kind of recover it. It just keeps draining some. So it's real important that we try to just at this point, I'm just going to add a little bit of color at a time. Okay, and I'm going to do the other one as well. And you'll notice that some of the paint is actually coming up and swirling in here. And that's okay, it does do that a little bit, and it's actually kind of a neat effect, and you will notice that, but you'll be surprised how much color is still actually left on the texture of the mold itself. All right. Another thing you notice is when we made the molds, we made sure that we made them on a flat surface so that we had a flat surface to actually cast these in. So it was really easy for us to pour because the bottoms of these have been flat. I've talked a lot about adding color to our pieces, to the castings, but now I want to talk about adding inclusions of different sorts. If you look at this mix of my treasures, there's a lot of different type of products I like to use. You know, again, a lot of these, some of these are vintage findings, little trinkets and treasures I found along the way, some nature. This one here is a bee, and they're fun. You know, nature and bugs are always fun to include in different layers of resin. Here again is some different type of sequences, and then we do have, like, these are small tiny beads, different metal colored leaf, and some tinsel. So again, there's so many things that you can actually add to your casting in addition to just color. But if you're going to mix color with your inclusions, you need to think a little bit about, is the color opaque? Is it transparency? Where do you want these pieces to actually lay within the casting? So these are some considerations that you need to think about before going forward and actually including them in a casted piece. Okay, now I want to talk to you about actually putting certain inclusions into different layers of your casting. You're going to find that, let's say with a bee, object we're going to use right now is this bee, and you might not want, and you're going to find that he might have a tendency to float to the top and kind of move wherever he wants, and you might, for the piece that you've already thought through, decided, I want him in the middle, and I want him to be in the middle of the middle. Well, how am I going to ensure that he does that in, you know, my 24-hour window of curing? The best way to do it is to think of doing this as in layers. So what I've done, I've decided I want him in a cube, kind of like an ice cube, and I've already put in probably about halfway up a layer of resin, and that's actually going to be the base that he sits on. And to make sure that he actually doesn't move or fall onto his side, what I want to do is I have 2-part epoxy, and I'm actually going to glue him down. Now remember, the 2-part epoxy acts like a resin. It's considered a resin. So what's nice is once I've glued him down and have allowed him to sit overnight to cure, when I pour the resin on top of him, it's actually going to become seamless with the resin and the epoxy that's already in there. So I am just going to actually take a couple little dabs of glue, and I just want to dab in place. And I don't have to be so neat on this because I know that the 2-part epoxy is actually going to act as a resin and look seamless once it has cured completely. Now you're going to note when you're looking at your 2-part epoxy that the label says it's 5-minute or 30-minute. Even though it says 5-minute or 30-minute, you need to know that it still takes a full 24 hours for it to cure fully. And what I need you to do, whatever you glue down, you are actually going to need to let it sit overnight close to your 24-hour window so that it is cured completely, because if it's not, what's going to happen is the resin isn't cured enough and it's just going to become liquid again with the resin that you pour on top, and therefore he's going to lift and move on you. So I have my bee here. I am ready to actually add him. And one other thing to note, depending on the objects that you're using to use for inclusions, what you might want to do, or should do too, some are going to be porous and have a lot of air. So in a bug or something of nature, there's a lot of air actually in his cavity. And what's going to happen is if I do put him in resin, he has a tendency to let some of those bubbles, that air bubble, collect and come out. And since it's a lot of air, it actually might cause you a bubble in here. So it's going to be important that we coat him with a thin coat of resin. And I've already done this, but all I do is I basically take a foam brush and I just lightly, real gingerly coat him. And you don't have to be real clean again. It doesn't, you don't have to worry about making it perfect because it's going to react with the resin that we pour on there and become a seamless integration anyhow. But the big thing is I want to coat him so none of the air, we're actually sealing in the air inside him as opposed to doing all kinds of steps to try and get it out of him. So now that I've done that, again, I already have my glue down here. You know, we have a kind of a spot of it. I'm going to use tweezers just because he's a little bit gentle. And I'm going to pick him up, and I do want him to be sitting up. So I am going to slowly put him in. And I might have to move him around a little bit, and I might, you know, to get where he was. And the nice thing with the 2-part epoxy, drying in 5 minutes, or curing the first level cure in 5 minutes, I don't have to hold this in place for a very long time. I can pretty much set it in place and it's ready to go. You know, I might only have to hold it for a few minutes in the spot that I want it to be. If I hadn't glued him on there, there was a good chance he could have fallen to his side, fallen over, moved over into the corner. So it is really important that you glue down pieces that you want to stay in a specific spot. Okay, now that we actually have our piece with the bee, we've glued him on yesterday, and I've let him sit overnight, at least 12 hours. We're going on about 18 hours, so that's a good time frame. And I am going to, now all I need to do is enclose him in resin. So, and by me pouring, I'm just going to slowly pour. Mainly, I don't want to pour too fast because I don't want to risk breaking one of his wings or anything like that. So I'm just going to slowly add some resin. Now you actually want to make sure that he's completely enclosed. And he's ready to go. You notice I did drip some on the side, but it'll be no big deal. And I can put him to the side to set overnight. Okay, now I'd like to talk a little bit about different gold leaves, little tiny beads, even glitter. There's so many great products out there that have really fun colors and just really fun textures. I use these a lot, and there's different things that you have to consider when working with these. Some are going to be heavy, like these beads, and some are going to be really lightweight, like these flakes of metal leaf. And it's important that we're thinking about that in our design. Now right here, I actually have already done my first layer of this one piece, and I wanted those beads to be heavy and sink to the bottom of this letter. But now I want to show you what happens if I add more resin and then I start to, now I want you to see what happens based on the type of product and how it reacts to the resin. So if you see these and you watch, you can kind of keep watching them. And they're starting to sink to the bottom pretty fast. They're disappearing pretty quickly. So if you look here, you can see that those small metal beads are actually falling all the way to the bottom. So I want to show you in contrast what happens if we put something like a glitter or a lightweight gold leafing and how it tends to float on the surface. You can see that they're pretty much going to stay at the surface, and a lot of times this lightweight stuff does. Again, you won't know for sure until the morning or until it's a product that you've worked with a few times so that you know how it reacts. But I do know that these type of gold leaves like to float on the top. Depending on how big my layers are or how much space in a layer will show pretty much how it's going to fall, whether it's going to have a lot of spacing between the layers of leaf. And the same thing with the beads. You might find that, hey, I want the beads to actually go all the way through the design. So again, you really need to be thinking about what you're working with. Is it lightweight and going to float, or if it's a heavyweight and if it's going to sink to the bottom, and how to work around that with your design elements. Right now, what I want to do is we're going to unmold these, so I'm going to show you how to demold them, and then also we're going to move on to how do I finish these so they look like a nice finished piece and not kind of the working piece that they are right now. So to start with, here is one of the two-part molds I did previously, and this is a little duck, and as you can see, I had put a gold powder Pearl X in the mold beforehand, and then I also did do kind of a gold translucent color, so you can kind of see how that plays into it. This one, I actually worked with a lot of our different powders as far as the tiny little beads, some of the glitters, and you can show a little bit here. You can kind of see how some of the beads ended up at the bottom, and then a lot of this stuff here right here is actually floating on the top. And when we finish this, you'll be able to see that a little more prevalent. But again, it's important to see this is how your things are going to come out of the mold. They're not going to be perfect, and there are going to be required finishing techniques that are really easy to clean it up and make it look like a great finished piece. Okay, now we're ready to actually start incorporating some of the finishing techniques. And most of these techniques are just basic sanding and filing techniques, so there's nothing special about it. It's just, again, knowing how to work with your materials that you have or the options out there. And this is also another time that you really need to be taking care of the safety, wearing your goggles, wearing a dust mask, because it is important. When you're sanding resin, resin can be pretty heavy duty, so make sure that you're taking care not to be breathing it in. Usually what I do to start with, I take a look at the piece and just kind of see what type of revisions I'm going to need to do or what type of work. You will notice that on the casting, this is the top of the casting that was pulled from the mold. If you kind of look here, I can illustrate it better. So now you can see that there's this lip on there, and there's really no way to avoid it in casting. It is just going to, it's just one of the ways the resin reacts to the casting. So what I'm gonna do a lot of times is I might even take scissors and trim some of this off. I can use my file to file just these big pieces down. You know, so basically I wanna get those big pieces out of the way. Same thing here, this one little corner. And I would do that around all sides. And then what I need to do is I need to file this and sand this piece. I want to sand it so it has a flat top. And what I do is once I have some of these pieces all kind of cleaned up on here, I literally just take my sandpaper, and again, you want to work wet. It helps to work wet. It helps keep the dust from the resin flying up. It also helps you actually sand a little bit faster. So typically what I do for this is I just put a little bit of water on my sandpaper. And again, you want to use a wet dry sandpaper. And at this point, I am going to do kind of a crazy 8. And again, this grade I'm using right now is actually very coarse because I want to get it flat before I really worry about smoothing it out. So I kind of go on a crazy 8, and by doing the crazy 8, as opposed to just doing a circle, it makes sure that your chances are you're going to get a much evener base or sanding on the back side. And again, I just kind of go around. Sometimes I switch my direction, but I'm going to keep doing this until I see those ridges completely disappear. Now you can see it's much flatter, but I still have a little ridge here. So I would continue doing this until the ridge is gone. So again, as I'm sanding along the way, I'm going to keep dipping my piece and actually topping the sandpaper with a little more water. And I'm just going to keep working at it until I get that completely flat on the back. And it goes fairly fast. Sometimes you can feel like it's putsy, but it really does happen, and you're able to get it nice clean, and it makes all the difference in your finished piece. Now if you look at this piece now, I pretty much have that ridge gone. There is still a little bit in the center here that is still a little bit lower, so I'm going to keep sanding until pretty much this whole area, the backside, looks matte like this, because I know then it's even. Now that the back is nice and flat, I'm able to start working on some of the other finishing techniques. So I'm going to turn it over. Again, I'm going to continue to work with it wet. I'll dip it in the water, but I'm going to switch now to emery boards, and I'm going to tell you why. The emery boards, especially if you go to some of the like Sally's Beauty Supplies or beauty supply places, there's some heavy duty emery boards, and what's nice about them is they come in different grades. So this one, for example, is a coarse, so it's going to have 100 and 180. Each side is different, and we can continue to go down all the way to the fine, and that is your 400 to 600 grit. So it's a really nice, they're easy, they're inexpensive, they're great size to kind of work in the size that we're working with, and they're just a nice way to finish off your pieces. But I'm going to show you the biggest trick is, again, you're going to want to work with your coarse emery board, and I'm going to work out any of these things that, like if you see here, there's a little extra edge up, and I'm going to do all the cleaning up. You know, I just really want to go around and do whatever I want to kind of clean up the shape. And again, I can use this if I want a rounded edge. I could actually go in and round the edge as well. So once I've got the shape and everything cleaned up, I can move on to the finer grades. And depending on the type of work, and you're going to find out what works best. But a lot of times you might not need to use all 6 of the sides. You know, you can maybe skip a few depending on what you're doing. So again, I started with my coarse, worked on the shape, and now I'm going to switch to the medium, because the nice thing with the medium and going through the different grades, it's actually allowing me to smooth out and continue working with that shape. I will also do it to the top of my piece, and if you look, you know, again, I want to make sure I'm kind of working in a motion that's moving so that I keep it even. And you see that I'm starting to pick up a little bit. Again, I'm going to keep sticking it in my water, coming back with it wet. I can even stick the emery board in there. And I'm just going to keep sanding. And by working with the medium grade, I'm actually walking it through a couple phases of finishing, and it's going to keep getting smoother and smoother. Now that I've worked with the medium grade, I'm ready to switch to the fine grade, and this is where I'm really going to do my finishing touches. Yeah, I'm going to keep sanding the sides. Okay, now that I've actually finished my sanding, and again, I sand it with the different grades or grits of sandpaper, starting with coarse down to fine, I'm ready to actually start polishing. And there are polishing grits of sanding materials out there as well. And what I'm going to use today is just an emery board as well, and basically this has a super fine and then even a finer, and then the final is a polishing grit. So again, you don't want any grit here. Really, this is going to work is to actually polish and shine up your piece. So I'm going to start to polish, and again, at this point it is really important to make sure that you do every grade of the grit along the way. And again, at this point, I just want to let you know I am actually polishing this dry. I no longer need to do this with a wet sandpaper. So I'm going to just and I'm just going to do the top so that you can kind of see quickly how it does polish. And I think I'm just going to do one side too, because I can illustrate it a little better for you. So I know I'm getting it smoother, and I can actually, to the touch, you can feel how smooth that is over this side. Now I'm going to switch to the white, which is the next grade. Now at this point I'm ready to do the final side, which is the gray, and that's the polishing. And you will see truly what an incredible shine and smoothness we can pull out of this piece. So I finished polishing the one side, and it's hard to see in the camera actually how shiny and smooth this area has gotten, but if you look down here you can see how it's still a little cloudy, and that blue doesn't have the same clear depth that it does up here. So you can kind of start to see how that is. And again, you really can't appreciate this until you're actually seeing it in person. One of the last finishing techniques I want to go over is putting our 2 parts together of the molds that we made when we were doing it more of a 3-dimensional mold where we had the 2 separate parts. So here are these 2 little rubber duckies. My daughter loves rubber duckies, so I do these a lot. But this mold was actually made, we've done the 2 parts, and I've already filed the sides and done some of the finishing work I need to do. And you do need to have 2 flat sides, because my goal is I'm going to put together these 2 sections. So I am using silly putty here, any clay, any soft clay. Also sometimes I use a bowl of rice. Anything that's going to allow this piece to kind of sit undisturbed, flat, is perfect. And again, it doesn't need to be pretty, because it's just going to be really, you know, it's just a vise that we need to hold the piece. Okay, now that I've had my 2 sides sanded, I am actually just going to glue the 2 pieces together. Now I have 2 options. I could use some resin and just put a thin coat on here and place this on top. But since I don't have any fresh resin made, what I am going to do is just mix up some 2-part epoxy. Remember, the 2-part epoxy works perfect with the resin. It becomes seamless, and it saves me from having to mix up a whole batch. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slowly put some of this glue down, and I'm going to want to smooth it out as best as possible. I will still do some finishing techniques to this after the 2 halves are put together. And then once I have my adhesive on here, it's as simple as just putting the 2 pieces together. I want to make sure that I push them down. I don't want to push them too hard that all the resin or glue is going to ooze out, because I do want to have some type of adhesive in here, but I can get it pretty close and still have the integrity of the piece. And it's that simple. Now I would wait, since we used 2-part epoxy, actually in probably about a half hour, I could do some finishing techniques just to sand off the rough edges around here. If I had used the resin though, I would have wanted to wait overnight before I did that. So, and I can just, now that it's had a chance to sit, I popped it out and I'm ready to go. Just need to clean her up. Some of you might be asking, how important is it to sand and finish your pieces? And when you looked at the different stages and steps that we did, you could clearly see how just pulling a piece from a casted, from a mold, it clearly was not a finished piece. And for professionalism and to be able to sell or give these away for gifts, it is really important that you take the time to clean them up and just make them look their best. And you might find, and as you get better at it, that you do things within the casting part that will help you so that you don't have to do so much finishing in the long run. Another area that people get in trouble with is when they're actually making their molds, they'll push down that piece too far into the mold material, and they'll end up, when they take the piece out, with either a small hole or just a really thin layer of mold material on the bottom. And what I have found has helped. I mean, chances are you're not going to be able to use that mold long term, but if you do want to get a couple good molds out of it, I would just put a piece of packing tape under it, give it a shot, and use it until it no longer can be used. I want to take a moment and talk about the mold materials that are out there and available. Now, we showcased and focused on a 2-part silicone putty, and there's a lot of products out on the market, different varieties of it, and they all basically work the same. But the one thing I really want to stress is I showed just pretty simply how it can be bubbly and how that the mold itself needs to cure. And the curing time of the mold affects how clean of a cast that you end up getting. So it is really important to kind of consider that. Be a little patient, kind of see where it goes, but know that you will, those first couple molds that you make, or those first couple castings you make of that mold, you are going to find different level of bubbles that are on the surface. And they will differ. Some manufacturers, some of the 2-part silicone putties will do it less, others might do it a lot in the beginning, but ultimately be a better mold in the long run. So again, play with just like with your materials and your resin, play with your mold material and understand its limitations. I want to take a few minutes and talk a little bit more about the mold material and molding. Remember, time is of the essence when you are working with these molding materials. I was finding in the studio that we were lucky to get 2 minutes out of them, where at home, in my home and conditions, I might have gotten 5. So again, be prepared with what you're ready to mold, know what you're going to do, and work fast on that. And make sure that you're not cross-contaminating the 2 products, because eventually you're going to start the process on unused product and you don't want to waste it. Since in this class we were working with resins, we were also sanding and drilling, it is important that we take a moment and talk about the safety issues and things that you should think about when you're working in your studio. Some of the basic safety issues that you need to consider are resin is a chemical, so we need to keep in mind that we're working in a well-ventilated area. I do go into a little more in depth on the safety issues with resin in my Bezel class, so feel free to take a look at that. But I want to talk more specifically about sanding and drilling and working and finishing your pieces. It's a whole different type of component that you're bringing into the situation. By sanding, you're actually picking up a lot of resin dust, and it is really, really important that you are using a mask at all time. And depending on how much sanding you're doing will depend on, you ultimately might want a heavy duty mask if you're doing a lot of resin work. But for some of the basic resin work or sanding that I was doing today, especially the wet sanding, you could get by with a dust mask. But I highly encourage and tell you, please take your safety, take caution, and just wear it. The other thing is important to have a pair of safety goggles on. Not only is that important for drilling, but you will find with sanding that sometimes you can brush up or dust up some dust that can get into your eyes. So again, just take the precautions and you won't have anything to worry about. I hope you've learned a lot of new things today that you can take forward into your own art with resin and casting. I look forward to seeing you at my next class.